So here's my story. I'm a woman and I'll be 19 this year. I was 15, almost 16 at the time of this incident. At the same time, I created my first Twitter account, which I deleted following the events of this story. A few details. I hadn't given my @ to anyone, not even my family, much less to my friends, for the simple reason that I didn't really have one. My profile photo was an avatar like on this site, so no photos of me at all. I put Paris as the location. I live in the suburbs, but it's faster to just put the general area than to find my specific place. I didn't have any followers really, only about 30 or so, and I didn't follow a lot of people either. Needless to say, it was not exactly a very interesting account, and I didn't even log on that often. One evening in October, though, I received a somewhat strange private message. It was an account that had maybe 200 followers or so, and the message said this: "Hi, my name is Paul. I just turned 17 and I wanted to know if you lived in so-and-so. I'm moving soon and I'm gonna be going to high school there. I was looking for some friends to make, so-and-so being the town where I'd gone to high school. I immediately knew something was wrong because so-and-so wasn't displayed anywhere on my profile. After thinking about it a bit, I remembered tweeting something about buses not passing by or something, and thought maybe that's how he found where I lived. The age didn't shock me either. I was about 2 years ahead of the rest of my schoolmates. Since I was bored and he had been quite polite so far, I told him that yes, I did live in the area, and I went to high school there as well. The conversation happened naturally, and we talked a lot that evening. Mainly about high school, the food in the canteen, teachers you should avoid, that sort of thing. A little later in the evening, he started interjecting more personal questions about me though. Do you live far from that school? Is it a house or an apartment? Do you still live with both your parents? How well do you get along with your family? There are 5 of you, huh? You shouldn't be home alone that often then, should you? I didn't answer because I found the following question strange, and unfortunately, he didn't insist either. I say unfortunately because if he had done so, I would have blocked him immediately, and that would have saved me from any further action. The next day, the same thing. We talked a lot, and he asked more personal questions to get to know each other, so I asked him some too. He always answered with what seemed to be utmost honesty. I always tried to dodge his questions about exactly where I lived, because he didn't really need to know that. It was the same routine for 2 or 3 weeks. I, like an idiot, had started to develop feelings. This guy was handsome and super nice to me, which was enough because I'd always been a loner, having been bullied for most of my schooling, especially because I was a bit ahead of the others. Even today, you only need to be a little bit nice to me for me to consider you basically my best friend. The main problem this behavior poses is that with feelings comes a blind trust, and unfortunately I'll grant that to just about anyone, even unconsciously. So our discussions continued on for several more weeks. Then, just before the start of the All Saints holiday, he told me that he was coming to my school. His mother had finalized their move, and he wanted it to be a surprise. He wanted a place to meet up the next day. Very happy, I gave him a time and place to meet, but when I told him that we would be surrounded by other people, he told me he didn't want to meet there. He would prefer an isolated place. He was afraid he wouldn't be able to recognize me, and he didn't want to waste all his time looking for me. I sympathized, and therefore pointed him to the toilets on the 3rd floor. Normally, you're not allowed to be there outside of class hours, so it would be fairly peaceful. It would be on the school grounds, so nothing could really happen to me. The next day, I got ready. I made myself pretty for our first meeting. I counted down the minutes, and when the time arrived, I went over to that bathroom area. I put on my best makeup and waited for him. When he arrived, he didn't look like a catfish. He looked exactly like his profile photo. but as I looked a bit closer, I could see he looked a little older than I thought he'd be. Maybe 20 years old instead of 17. We talked, got along really well, and I was over the moon. He offered to take me to lunch at a fast food restaurant, which I refused because I didn't have any money on me. I never accept any offers for people to pay for my things. It's a bit of a principle of mine. He looked disappointed, but quickly got back to his feet metaphorically, and suggested for me to wait for a while so he could take me home. I explained to him that I had to take the bus, but he could accompany me to the stop if he wanted to. He once again looked disappointed, but he accepted. That's exactly what happened, and it quickly became a sort of routine. We'd meet on the third-floor toilets at 10 o'clock, and in the evening he'd walk with me until the bus. Surprisingly, I never came across him in the corridors or the canteen. I told myself that was normal. The building was super big. There were more than 1,500 students there, so it was logical that our schedules would not coincide and for us to not really cross paths with one another. This whole routine would last until December, so almost a month and a half or so. On December 14th, a Thursday, during a conversation, I complained because my father had gone on a trip for work. My brother was still with his friends. My sister was on a school trip, and this time my mother had to stay at work late too. I was reckless. After several weeks of discussion, I thought I could trust him, especially with my history of feelings and my problems with trust being granted too quickly. In the evening, he walked me to the bus stop. I climbed in, waved, and put on my headphones and sat down. I had 2 stops before I arrived home. It was 5:45 p.m., so it was already dark when I got off the bus. Immediately, I got a strange feeling. I had a very unpleasant sensation in my stomach, and I could tell I was being watched from somewhere. I have this reflex, which is to turn off the music but keep my headphones on so I could hear anything that's going on around me. It was probably what saved my life. I live in a residential area cut off on the main road by a block of buildings, so it's always very quiet, even when there's traffic nearby. I left to rush to my neighborhood, and the feeling of being watched intensified even further. When I started to hear footsteps behind me, I knew I was right. Someone was following me. Fortunately, I could hear he was not speeding up to catch up to me. He had matched my steps instead. He was just keeping a distance between us for now, but I had no idea how long that would last. I slipped my hand into my pocket to grab my keys. I took them out, making as little noise as possible. Suddenly, I began the fastest sprint of my life to my home, hoping the surprise of me taking off was enough to give me the time to open my door and especially close it. The bluff worked. I don't know how it did, but it sure did. I ran inside and deactivated my home alarm, which unfortunately confirmed I was alone. I leaned against the closed door and breathed. My front door is glass, which means that if I stand up, I can see what's going on outside. But if someone outside wants to see what's going on inside, they can as well. I hesitated for a moment, and when I stood up, I looked out the window. I could see Paul out on the road, a few meters away from my house, staring at me with an ominous look on his face. He'd followed me home, probably in a car, and he clearly didn't have any good intentions. I couldn't play the bluff of saying I'm not alone, because he knew that was not true. Fear paralyzed me. I didn't know what to do. We stared into each other's eyes for a good minute until I regained control of my body. After making sure 3 times I'd locked the door, I ran into the kitchen to grab a knife. By the time I got back, he was right at the front door banging on it. First, he punched to break the window, but when he saw me coming at him with my knife, he started to kick hard against the lock to break it too. At that moment, I pushed against the door, praying it would hold and the glass was sturdy. He, for his part, increased his assaults against the glass door, and that was the longest moment of my life. This struggle that lasted 5 minutes felt like it lasted for hours. When he finally realized the door wasn't just going to let go, he stopped and started circling around the house, knocking on every window he found, trying to open them and get inside. Once again, though, none of them gave in. He came to the back door looking pretty pissed off. I figured I was in for a second round. Luckily, my neighbor's car pulled up to the curb at that exact moment, and Paul ran away. Probably he thought it was my mother arriving home. I waited in the dark for 2 hours until my mom came, knife in one hand and phone in the other. I quickly double-checked all the locks to make sure none had broken. Thankfully, everything was fine. I sat with my back to the door in silence until I recognized the sound of my mother coming in. I went up to my room before she arrived, and I didn't say anything to her. For me, I thought this story was behind me, but I was wrong. What followed was not as violent as what I experienced that evening, but it is important to talk about. On Twitter, Paul started harassing me, insulting messages, threats, and such, until I blocked him and deleted our conversation. His account disappeared at the same time. Not long after, accounts that had just been created started following me en masse. They all had an @ made up of a series of numbers and the first letter of his name. As soon as I blocked one, another would subscribe to me and all send me messages of the same type. I had to block more than 50 accounts in total, and that's where I made a mistake. I ended up permanently deleting my Twitter account because I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't think to ever reactivate it. Later in high school, I asked some people who were supposed to be in Paul's class about him, but none of them had ever heard of him. The guy wasn't at my high school at all. That's probably why I never met him outside of our daily meetings. My first impression was the right one. He was probably not 17 at all, but at least in his 20s. I never heard from Paul again after that day. I didn't file a complaint. Firstly, because I was a minor and didn't want to tell my parents since I was very ashamed of having been tricked like that, but also I now had no proof. Because I deleted my Twitter account, he too had deleted his, and so all our messages were gone. I didn't have any photos of him or what had been said. I'm 99% sure the name he gave was fake as well. In fact, he refused to ever give me his last name. I only had a vague description in my own testimony. That's not enough to file a complaint, as frustrating as that can be. I've often asked myself what he wanted from me. The answer that seems most credible to me is human trafficking, because all his behavior resembles a pattern that leads to kidnapping. Targeting a girl online that doesn't have much presence or confidence, being buddy-buddy, breaking into her high school to get closer to her, and waiting until she's vulnerable to grab her. Be careful when you're approached online. There's no need to be paranoid or anything. Not everyone means to harm you, but it's always good to be vigilant and careful. Hello, my name is William. I'm 18 years old and I live in Canada. I'm telling you this story about 10 days after it happened. I work in a big city and I live about 1 hour away from this city. That means 2 hours of driving each day on the way to and back in the complete darkness of country roads. Halfway between my workplace and my house, I found myself trapped behind a white Hyundai which was moving unusually slowly. For context, the roads are limited to 90 kilometers per hour, but almost everyone drives 100 to 110, sometimes even more for some, and that's in complete darkness. This person was driving 70. At the time, I told myself it wasn't very serious. I could simply wait until I had a straight line to overtake them. Shortly after this reflection of mine, though, this person suddenly started to give me brake checks for no reason, basically pressing lightly on the brakes just enough for the lights to come on, but not actually braking. I had a bad feeling about this guy. As I paid more attention to this vehicle, I noticed the car in front of me also had no license plates. While noting this, he continued to brake check me. I was starting to wonder if he was trying to tell me something about my vehicle. That's when I noticed I was still on the high beams. I turned them down, and when I raised my head again, I saw that same car was now less than a meter away, having braked very violently. I hit his vehicle, which was almost at a complete stop. I slammed right in at about 60 kilometers per hour, at least I estimate so. The airbags blew right away, and by the time I realized what had just happened, I noticed a man was emerging from the car. He was of fairly average height and rather stout as well. One of my 2 headlights was still working, so I was able to see his face with an almost demonic smile. He had a hammer in his hand, and he approached me slowly. I panicked. I locked all my doors manually. He stood in front of my vehicle, staring at me for several long moments. He raised his hammer and shattered my only remaining headlight. That's when I realized what he'd just done. He had made me invisible to any car coming from behind me at a very high speed, in hopes of causing a second accident. I got out of my vehicle. I was several hours away from any villages. I decided straight away to call emergency services. The police, ambulance, and tow truck arrived shortly. I told them about everything. The results of the incident were a broken nose and my car being completely trashed. It was an old car, but one that I loved more than anything. A 2001 Ford Mustang convertible for those curious. Surprisingly, the man didn't try to attack me myself. I hadn't heard from this individual again. That is, until today. The car he was driving had of course been stolen. I read that the man in question was already wanted for 2 other similar attacks where he used the same methods. The man is still wanted today. To help me out and reassure me, my employer lent me a company vehicle, a Chevrolet Silverado. It's a pretty big pickup, so if that ever happens again, I'm just gonna run that fucker's car right over. Despite everything that's passed by since then, getting to my job is still a time of intense stress, and driving in the dark remains very difficult for me. During the summer of 2012, I was 11 years old. I went with my parents to Ecuador in Latin America for about 3 weeks or so. It's a country with truly incredible landscapes, cultures, and villages, but unfortunately it remains a predominantly poor area. We had a really great vacation, but a few things happened for me to write this story out. Fortunately, this only happened the last night of our stay, and therefore did not spoil the rest of the trip. We went our stay traveling to all corners of the country, thanks to the bus system which circulated all throughout. This last evening, we arrived in the capital at around 7 p.m. to spend our last night there, since we were taking the plane the next day for 3 p.m. Kind of winging it during our trips, we hadn't yet booked a hotel to stay at, so we went looking for hotels. There was nothing available though. It was all either mediocre or completely full. We finally decided to stay at this really bad hotel. Very dirty, stank of cigarettes, stains all over the place, a really run-down building. In short, our only option. My parents therefore decided to take a last tour of the city after putting our things in our room. They didn't want to stay in that hotel unless it was to sleep. I felt like I was dying. I wanted to stay there and rest because I was unwell. But hey, I was 11 years old, and my parents didn't want to leave me alone. We went out to eat, took some photos, and enjoyed the atmosphere one last time. When we came back around 11 p.m. though, we were startled to find a mass of police and ambulances in front of our hotel. They went to explain to my parents what was happening. I remember my parents' faces being totally shocked, but I couldn't understand what was going on at all. The officer was speaking Spanish, and I didn't know that language at all. Police officers came out of the hotel 5 minutes later with our belongings. They took us straight to the airport. I didn't understand what was happening. My parents would only tell me there was a water leak, so we couldn't stay there any longer. I believed them. We slept at the airport in the security offices, secure and more comfortable than any airport seats. We returned to France the next day, and I pretty much forgot about this incident. Some time ago though, while looking at photos of our trip, I remembered this story, and I asked my parents about that night. What they told me really shocked me. That infamous evening, while we were out on the town, a mentally ill man had entered the hotel armed and butchered all of the tourists inside until he was finally confronted and killed by the police. There were 9 deaths in total, including the perpetrator. 8 tourists were killed, some of whom we'd even spoken to on the way to check in. According to my sources, there were no French people killed that evening. 2 English couples and an entire German family. When I learned that, I was terrified. I could have never believed such a tragedy had happened. I said to myself that if my parents had let me rest in the hotel that evening like I wanted to, I may have been butchered as well. Unfortunately, tragedies like this can happen at any time, and to anyone. You have to enjoy your life while you have it. We only have one, and it's a sacred thing.